So as I was thinking about what I would say today, I thought, you know, when I talk to journalists in particular, now those of you in this audience are much more sophisticated than the your ordinary New York Times reporter, let's say. They almost always get 5 things wrong about poverty. So I decided to talk about those 5 things. I'm sure you have those things right, but pieces of these things you may not realize, and you may not emphasize them in the same way that someone who spent the last 25 years trudging around low-income neighborhoods would emphasize. Many of these things are, of course, familiar to Ron, and he'll give you a somewhat different take, although I think we probably agree on the facts, which is encouraging. So, poverty fact number 1. Now here I have Ron's book, Work Over Welfare, which I think is one of the best books written about welfare reform. If you haven't read it, you need to. It is an astonishing story of how policy gets made, and too often people who care about poverty don't know enough about policy. The second is the journalist Jason DeParle's book, American Dream, about welfare reform, and specifically its epicenter, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But I would argue that a decade and a half after welfare reform was implemented, by the way, does everyone know that welfare reform actually occurred? 1996, personal responsibility, PRORA, right? This terrible name. Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act. Something no one can remember except those of us who write about it over and over again. Represented a fundamental sea change in how we care for the poor in the United States. Okay, we essentially ended cash welfare. Currently, only 1.1 million adults are in the rolls. I ask my students all the time, you know, these smart Harvard students, how many people do you think are on welfare? 5 million, you know, some hands go up. 10 million, more hands go up. 30 million, you know, the rest of the hands go up. Then I say 1 million, there are no hands left. Of course, the right answer is 1 million. It's really fun to ask that question, but the right answer is 1 million. We essentially ended cash welfare in 1996 and replaced it with a very powerful work-based safety net. I think there's a lot of evidence that welfare reform has been, and you know, as someone who's maybe a little left of center, this is hard for me to say. It's been a smashing success. But it's also been a colossal failure. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So let's start with the success part of the story. How many of you have heard of the EITC? Okay, good. Again, when I ask my students this, they look at me blankly and say, what's that? Most Americans have never heard about this program, which is surprising since we spend a whole lot of money on it. But as you know, the EITC started out as a tiny little program in 1975. It was expanded dramatically by the Clinton administration to make good on the promise that if you worked in America and you had dependent children, you would not be poor. Okay, and it fulfills that promise almost to the dime. Okay, one of the people responsible for the modern EITC is my dean, David Ellwood. I just finished a book on the EITC. It has a great story of Ellwood, along with Janet Holtzblatt, Wendell Primus, Bruce Reed, other folks who were instrumental in crafting the EITC. But the EITC is why welfare reform worked. It's why we went from over 4 million adults on the rolls to only about 1 million adults on the rolls. Okay? There are other reasons, expanded child support, a lot of sticks came along with welfare and so on, but mainly it was the EITC that made welfare a success. And I'm going to argue that it did so beyond our wildest dreams. So let me give you a little bit of evidence. First, the EITC is big money. Currently, if you've got 3 kids, you can get up to $6,000 in February when you file your taxes from the EITC, right? $6,000. Plus, you can get a couple $1,000s from the child tax credit. We're talking a very hefty portion of your annual income. It used to be that you had to either collect welfare or work. When I wrote Making Ends Meet with Laura Lane, right, you didn't have the option really to combine welfare for employment because you got taxed by about $1 for every dollar you earn. Now you get to keep everything you would have gotten from welfare and then some, and you can keep almost all of your wages. There is no doubt that if you manage to find a full-time, full-year job in America, you are better off under the new welfare regime than you would have been under the old. True, you can't work that side job, that quote-unquote illegal job that you had while you were collecting welfare in the old system. But work actually pays more than, formal work usually pays more than informal work. And you feel a lot better not having to, quote-unquote, cheat in order to survive. Okay? So just in dollars and cents terms, welfare reform, colossal success. It's important to know that it's targeted toward the poor and the near poor. This just shows how the EITC is shaped. It's really focused on families earning between $13,000 and $17,000 a year. That's where you get that peak amount. Then it tapers off gradually so you don't feel punished for adding more hours or getting a slight wage at work. And at the bottom, of course, it encourages you to push your work up to a full-time, full-year schedule. Okay? Now, just to get a sense of how dramatic the changes with regard to welfare reform were, we see the sharp decline. The chart starts in 1976, ends in 2000. I could have continued to draw out the line. It would be even lower now. We went from serving 5.1 million families, an all-time high, right, in the early 1990s, a recessionary period, to only about 1.8 million households in 2000. And again, the figures are even lower still now. Huge decline. We tried to reform welfare again and again and again before the 1996 reforms. We largely failed. This, by any standards, is a huge change. Look at the countervailing force of the EITC. We only give about $5 billion, into the pockets of the welfare poor, in cash welfare these days. The rest goes for other purposes. But we give away about $64 billion in cash assistance to EITC recipients. Rather than 1.1 million adults, we have 25 million tax filers. 25 million tax filers collecting the EITC. And most Americans have never heard about the program. But the most profound change, and this is really the thesis of the book I wrote with three former students, Sarah Halpern-Meakin, Jen Sykes, and Laura Tack, hasn't been in how much money you got, but how you felt about it. So on the left we have, this is the neighborhood of East Boston, right, where I did this research. This is the old welfare office. Okay, it's covered with a century's worth of grime. It has bars on the window. In letters over the door, it says, overseers of the public welfare. If you weren't ashamed to go in, you would be by walking through these doors. This huge flagpole jutting out. This is now an abandoned building, I think sort of representing the demise of cash welfare. But I wrote a book with Laura Lane, and dozens of other books have been written about the stigma and the shame that people who collected cash assistance suffered. As T.H. Marshall has written, people who collect public relief have to sort of trade their citizenship in exchange for the benefits. And indeed, the old welfare system, through the stigma costs it imposed, forced you to trade your citizenship, to leave your citizenship, to leave your sense of being a real American at the door. Now, where do the poor get assistance, at least the working poor? They go to the glossy doors of the H&R Block. 70% of EITC filers claim their benefits at agencies like H&R Block, right? And what are you at H&R Block? Are you a dependent? Are you a recipient? Or are you a customer? If you walk into the office in East Boston, this is actually from Hoboken, but I have nice little pictures of East Boston. I didn't have time to insert into the PowerPoint here. You are greeted with a smile. There are literally a staff of people lined up, smiling, in professional clothing, waiting to assist you. There are children's books in the window seat. There is a bright and cheery waiting room, right? And when you go through those doors, you are not saying, I'm set apart because I'm entering the doors of the overseer of the public welfare. Instead, you are entering the halls of the American taxpayer because you're filing your taxes in the way that every other American, except those who have discovered TurboTax, files their taxes. First laugh of the morning, you're waking up. Good. Good, okay? So rather than stripping you of citizenship, the EITC and its tie to work, you know, and to work is to be an American. This is our culture, right? This is our culture. Maybe it shouldn't be our culture, but it is our culture. You are essentially getting a stamp of citizenship. You are saying, I'm a worker, I file my taxes like everybody else, I'm a taxpayer, I'm part of America. And when you interview folks, as we did in Boston, right, we followed folks over 6 months' time, from the time they collected their check to 6 months later when they'd spent most of it, and I can tell you that most of it is spent in responsible purchases. You'd feel quite, I think you'll feel quite happy when you see the allocation results that we're about to publish. People are really proud, right? This isn't welfare. They don't think of this as welfare. This is anti-welfare. This is something they've earned. And they talk about being real Americans. They talk about being part of the mainstream. And they talk about their dreams and goals for upward mobility. And indeed, they save and spend for those purposes. I don't think you're fully getting how big this is. How many of your grandfathers received farm subsidies? Okay, so I come from a farming community in northern Minnesota, and farmers hate welfare. You know, if you talk to people in my home church, they'll say, people on welfare, they're scum. But my grandfather, who said those words, was a frequent recipient of farm subsidies. Was that welfare? No, he earned it. So this is the contrast between the old system and the new. It's something you can take pride in, not something that makes you feel ashamed. But that's the happy side of the coin. The problem with the EITC, of course, is that it's not a safety net, right? It doesn't catch you when you fall. It's a wage subsidy that lifts you up when you're working, you're doing the right thing. It reinforces the value of work. It gives dignity to a quote-unquote bad job. But what about if you can't get a job or keep a job, or if you're a victim to the new economy in which many low-wage employers are hiring you full-time on call? So if there are no customers in the store, you're sent home. What about then? This is the cover of a policy brief I wrote with Luke Schaefer, who's at the School of Social Work at the University of Michigan. This is a National Poverty Center poverty brief. If you don't know that website, it's an excellent one. And what we show is that at the same time the EITC was lifting about 3.5 million children out of poverty every given year, nearly an equal number in any given month are experiencing what we call extreme poverty, poverty only seen in the developing world, or so we thought. Families with children living on less than $2 per person per day. And in this policy brief, we document the fact that we've roughly doubled the number of families with children living in extreme poverty since welfare reform was initiated. Furthermore, it's not a recession effect. The change was monotonic. Okay? Now, the good news is that food stamps is working really hard to help these families. About half of them get food stamps. And if you count food stamps as cash, which is a bit of a dubious thing to do, right? Because not very many people sell their food stamps, and you can't really trade your food stamps to pay the light bill very easily. Right? Even if you sell your food stamps, you only get about 70 cents on the dollar, 60 cents on the dollar in some cities. Okay? Can you imagine? Can you imagine living on less than $2 per person per day? For the last 2 summers, Luke has been crunching the numbers from the Survey of Income and Program Participation. This brief is based on those numbers. And I've been going around trying to find families living in these conditions and hanging out with them. I hung out with 4 such families in Chicago last summer. I've been hanging out with 4 such families in Cleveland, Ohio this summer. This is real, and it's something that I had not seen before as a poverty researcher in the pre-welfare era. So people are falling through the net, and over 3 million children at any given time, in any given month, are experiencing a spell of extreme poverty. Most of those children are experiencing a spell of at least 3 months in duration. So welfare reform, an amazing success. And at least for some, those falling through the net, a colossal failure. Poverty fact number 2. Lately I've been going around saying there are no single mothers. Now, you know, a hook should come and eject me off the stage at this moment. Clearly, this can't be true. We know that 42% of all children, right, are born to quote-unquote single mothers. And I put on here, I think, the 2 seminal books on single parenthood written in modern times, both co-authored by Sarah McClanahan, Single Mothers and Their Children, which came out in the 1980s, and Growing Up with a Single Parent, What Helps, What Hurts, which came out in the 90s. If you have not read both of these books, you should. But Sarah McClanahan went on to found the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Study, a data source that lets us peer into the lives of single mothers like we never have before. And indeed, what this study reveals, and work I'm going to show you in a minute, I actually did with Sarah and Laura Tack from Cornell University, does show that there are no single mothers, at least among the population of Americans that has a non-marital birth. Now let me show you what I mean. So a child can become a child of a so-called single parent in several ways. Perhaps the parents never had a relationship in the first place, or perhaps the relationship breaks up. And either way, you have what we call relationship instability. Now, Americans are rather unique among adults in rich nations. We love to partner. We love to break up. And we love to repartner. And we like to do it fast. Okay, so it's not just college students who are engaged in this, it's lots of Americans. And when mom and dad break up, they often take on a new partner, symbolized by the hearts. Okay? Now, these are data from the Fragile Families and Child Wellbeing Survey, and they show the percentage of children born to an unmarried parent. And by the way, when I say married, unmarried, we have to face the fact that in America, the way we stay together is through marriage. It is an artifact of our culture. It's not, I'm not making a moral statement here, it just is a fact, right? Cohabitation in the United States, including cohabitation among parents, is very unstable. This is not true in some of Western Europe. Cohabiting relationships are more unstable, I believe this is true, than married relationships everywhere. But the difference is not as great, not nearly as great as in Western Europe. But in our country, if you don't get married, you usually break up, and you usually do so rather quickly, okay? So among people who have a non-marital birth, and of course in the United States, this is almost all people in the bottom 2/5 of the income distribution, even now, when non-marital childbearing has reached 42% of all children, children are experiencing their parents entering into new romantic relationship. And this is the proportion of children who've experienced at least one of these transitions to a new romantic partnership by age 5. You can see that some of these children are experiencing very, very rapid partner cycling. Now, family complexity comes in when those adults have subsequent children. Of course, the mom and the dad may be bringing in half-siblings from other relationships because they're in as Sarah McClanahan says, they're sort of dating and having children at the same time. And so you can have half-sibs already in place when that focal child comes into the world, or you can have additional half-siblings that come out of the new relationship. And of course, there are the step-siblings as well. And if you try, as Linda Burton often does, an anthropologist from Duke University, you can chart these very, very complex families. And through ethnographic data, you can actually document how enormously complicated it is to manage, for a child to manage these complex family relationships. If you buy Doing the Best I Can, which of course you should, along with both of Ron's book and my other book, I'm sure you'll be rewarded in some cosmic sense if you do so. You'll read the story of Andre Green, who met 3 of his half-brothers by chance within the course of a month. It's a very dramatic story, okay? So as you can see, in these non-marital, among these parents who had a non-marital birth, by the child's 5th birthday, a very large number have half-siblings. And when you add those all together, you see that 78% of children born non-maritally are, by age 5, in families that are either unstable, complex, or both. Now, it's important to note that 18% are in stable 2-parent families. Okay, some of these family relationships work, and they work well, and they look more like marriage, although not exactly like marriage. But look at that stable single mother family figure. 4%, ladies and gentlemen. We had imagined that the alternative to being in a 2-parent married family was living with a stable single mother. This was the mental imagination of researchers. And we were wrong. We actually don't know anything because there's such a small sliver of the pie that is stable and single about how those kids are doing. Much of what we've coded as single motherhood is probably, although we don't have good historical figures, unstable and complex family life. Now, we know from the work going all the way back to Mavis Hetherington that kids can adjust to family change. In her work on divorce, kids adjusted in about a year. But in this population, the rate of change is so great that emerging research is at least suggesting that it may be simply too much for children, and particularly boys, to absorb. And this is not going on in Europe. We are the outlier. You might think that Sweden and France are more liberal than the United States. They look far more conservative when you look at breakup by age 15. Our kids are experiencing a lot more of this than kids in other rich nations. In fact, our closest peer in this regard is Latvia. Poverty fact number 3. I recently, with my friend Ron Haskins, was at a meeting of the Family Self-Sufficiency Working Group, Technical Working Group, at the Administration for Children and Families, part of the Department of Health and Human Services in Washington. And Ron was there, so he can attest to this. We went through the whole day talking about families as if they only included mothers and children. Finally, around 1:30 in the afternoon, I had a meltdown. I feel ashamed that I couldn't control my emotions, and I said, wait a minute, what are we doing? We can't talk like this about the family. And it could be that someone to my left said, well, these men aren't really engaged in these households anyway. They are. And we've got to pay attention to fathers. And we've got to realize that fathers are not hit-and-run men who just want to impregnate women and selfishly flee. To quote William Bennett, we could even quote our own president, right? Bill Cosby. Okay, very famous quote, which I won't repeat here because I'm being taped. But he said it, not me. So fathers are engaged with their kids. They want to be engaged. In fact, there is a father thirst among men that's palpable. I'm going to show you some evidence of that. And if we ignore it, we're courting disaster, because if we don't connect men to families, they're not connected to any other institutions. And we know that people without any institutional ties do what? They get in a lot of trouble, right? We also have to remember that half of the children, single mothers, who we love to love single mothers, right? I wrote a very nice book about single mothers, and people kept saying to me, what about the dads? I said, I don't need to talk to the dads. I don't even want to meet these men. You know, I had a hostile attitude, to be honest, about these men before I started talking to them. But we must address them, because half of their children are male children, and we can't give up on half the population. Okay, so what about the dads? Dads show by their actions, not just by their words, that they want to be involved with their kids. These, again, are the Fragile Families data. This is how often the fathers are involved. Daily means the dad's living with the mom and the kid. Okay? Weekly is that the measure in Fragile Families says, are you involved several times weekly? And the average is about 8.5 visits per month. So this is about what divorced dads do, middle-class divorced dads do. Okay? So this is a pretty significant level of involvement. If we just look at weekly involvement and we say, you know, the rest just isn't sufficient, these kids really need their dads on a regular basis, we see an involvement rate of 66% 1 year after the child is born. 5 years later, it's half. Now, is that a lot or a little? Certainly it is not enough, but it is not zero, right? 5 years is a long time. It's a long time to spend with your kid. If we could draw these figures out, which we can't yet, the Fragile Family Survey has not gone far enough. We're about to get the 9-year results. We're going to start seeing really diminishing rates of father involvement. We know from other data sources that this is likely. Okay, but at least initially, a lot of men are very involved. Now, second piece of evidence. We asked dads the following questions. Think back to the moment when you first learned she was pregnant. What was your first reaction to the news? So, you know, we had no idea what we were going to find in this study. We were completely wrong in our predictions. We thought they'd say, oh my gosh, I wanted to cut and run. I didn't want the responsibility. I tried to pressure to terminate the pregnancy. This is not what we found. A young man in the book, Andre Green, I'll mention his name again, tells the following story. So he was, really young, still in high school, and he was coming home from a choir tour. He'd gotten involved in a local choir. He's a Camden kid, okay? And he comes home to his Aunt Shirlene's house, where he and his mom and his brother and his 2 little sisters and his stepfather are doubled up with his Aunt Shirlene, because his brother's just gotten murdered and his mom has returned to her cocaine addiction to sort of deal with the pain. The whole family is sort of in chaos. He opens that door and his Aunt Shirlene is in the kitchen. You know, this is the shotgun-style row houses that populate much of Camden, Philadelphia, Baltimore. The kitchen's right inside. And Aunt Shirlene says, I've got some news for you. And he says, what is it? And she says, you know that old girlfriend of yours, Sonia? And he says, yeah, remembering this relationship that lasted a matter of weeks and was over a long time ago. And then Shirlene sort of pauses, drawing out the drama. Andre's impatient, like what's she trying to pull? And then Charlene says 2 words, she pregnant. So Andre recounts slamming his fist on the counter, stomping up the stairs to his bedroom, slamming the door, looking around to make sure nobody's listening. And then he begins to jump around, shouting, thank you, Jesus. Now, this just happened to be the very first young man we interviewed in Camden. I was stunned. I thought the guy was an anomaly. As it turns out, he is a little bit on the enthusiastic side. But if you code up all the reactions to pregnancy, about 77% of the guys either respond with happiness or acceptance. Oh, of course. And I'll show you some of these responses in a minute. And we replicated these in a subsample of the Fragile Families study. And these data were not coded by me. We had 4 independent coders. Mothers, as you notice, are much less happy with the news than fathers are. Interesting. We can talk about that later. But just to give you some of the flavor of the data, Daryl, who's African American, says, I lit up. Stan wanted a kid real bad. Paul says, you know that I'm getting away to go away to prison, and it really is your choice, but I want you to have the baby because I don't have any kid, and I'd like to have a child. Steve wanted a child deep inside. Bernie had wanted a kid for years. Bucket says, this is, you know, they choose their own pseudonyms, right? And he washes windows, so he chose the name Bucket. Says, shoot, I was happy, man. Amin, who's featured in chapter 2, says, even though I was not in love, I wanted a son. Wilbert says, I was so happy, even though in the back of my mind I wondered, is it mine? Lacey says, I was going to have a baby. I was happy. And this is very common. Like, what are you asking me this question, you idiot? Okay? I'm going to skip O. Well, O is a character. But let's look at Stephen. Stephen's response was perhaps the most typical. And again, reflecting Lacey's, what's wrong with you people for asking me this question, he says, I was glad it was no major obstacle. Now, this does not correspond with men's circumstances at the time of the pregnancy in any sort of perfect way. In fact, some of the men in the worst circumstances were the most enthusiastic. Whites. Joe wanted a son. James planned it at 16. He wanted to have a kid, but he didn't really think about the financial. Roger always wanted one. Little E just wanted to be a dad. James says, when I found out she was pregnant, everything changed. I was like, I don't care if she's cheating. And at first, I was so happy. Monte said he was ready. Kevin said, I loved it. I love kids. Again, this, of course. And Gianni says, I thought, oh, sweetie, I'm going to be a daddy. That was my feeling. If I could have bottled it and kept it, I would have. We asked Elvis, what did you think your future was going to be like before you had him? His son, Elvis says, I wasn't going to live past the age of 30. And then once you had him, I can't even picture my life without Elvis in it. I had already made a promise to myself. I had told my friends I don't want to live past the age of 30. If I make it to 30, I'm going to take myself out. He came into the picture when I was like 27, and all that changed. Everything changed. My whole life changed. We asked Lacey, what would your life be like if you hadn't had your children? I can't imagine that one. I really can't, because my life without them, it would be empty. It would be empty. Because that's what kept me going, knowing I had to come out of jail to be there for them. How did you see your future before you became a father? I didn't have no future. I didn't care. I lived for the moment. Did you think you'd live to see 42? No, nobody did. Nobody expected me to be there to see 17. Now, we not only interviewed folks in Camden and Philadelphia, we hung out there and experienced daily life. We lived in one of the neighborhoods of Camden, East Camden, 36th and Westfield, for those of you who know Camden, for 2.5 years. While we were there, a local elementary school held an essay contest. And this little quote was written by the winner of this middle school essay contest. Pay careful attention. She says, every day I look at the news, I hear about something that happened in Camden, whether it's a shooting, a drug bust, a missing kids, a fight, a robbery. And it upsets me. Every time I hear about someone getting killed, I picture that person being someone in my family or someone I really care about. And she ends the essay with these words. Put down the guns and pick up the babies. So what's going through Andre Green's mind when he says, thank you, Jesus, is not, I can now establish my manhood. I can now brag to my peers. It's, my dad was a dog, and I don't want to do that to a child. It's, I don't have anything going for myself. Here's a chance, a child, something pure, something perfect. As we're interviewing him, he's holding his little baby, Jalissa, in his arms. He's carefully fashioned her hair into twists. He's taken her to church, and the church ladies have complimented him on what great care he's taking of his daughter. And as he looks down on this child, he then looks up at us and says, "My child, she's the bomb." That's what Andre Green is thinking when he says, "Thank you, Jesus, to a birth that wasn't even, a conception that wasn't even remotely planned." Poverty fact number 4, and this is the dismal news about dads, to be frank. This father thirst, when combined with high rates of instability and complexity and rapidly shrinking economic fortunes, along with concentrated poverty and violence of the kind that sent Andre Green's brother to the morgue just a month before his girlfriend Sonia's news was revealed, means that most dads don't stay involved with that focal child over the life course. But their father thirst must be addressed. So they continue, just like the stick figures I showed you, to try to reenact fatherhood in new relationships. So if you look at the National Longitudinal Survey of Youth, which we and Robert Lerman and Elaine Sorensen have done in 2 different waves, coming up with the exact same figures, most dads, most non-marital dads, are both good dads to some kids and bad dads to others at the same time. Now here's the positive, good dad part of the story. These are young men in their late 20s, okay, the prime family building years. All of them had at least one non-marital birth. This is just restricted to those with at least 2 kids. What you can see is that 80% of them are involved at least weekly with at least one of their children. They're intensively involved in the way that Andre Green is involved with Jalissa. But a third of these men have no contact with another one of their children. Another 14% only see them monthly. And again, these are young men, so the figures are going to get worse over time. Lerman and Sorensen looked at an earlier wave of the NLSY, and at 3 different age cohorts found this exact same pattern of men being both good dads to some of their children, satisfying that father thirst, but literally abandoning others of their children at the same time. We call this pattern serial selective father involvement. Monte, for example, has broken up with LaShawn. LaShawn has his son and another son to whom Monte played daddy in a very, very intensive way. But now he only talks occasionally on the phone to these 2 children, offers nothing in terms of financial support because he has had 2 children with Quinessa. He also, in part, supports Quinessa's 2 other children by another man who happens to be in prison. And Quinessa lives with Monte's sister, who has 3 children, who he also helps to support. So Monte, if you look at Quinessa's household, is a super dad. But if you look at LaShawn's household, he's a dismal dad. So let's take David. David is a 4-time father failure. His first relationship, in which he produced 2 daughters, ended relatively early, about when the girls were 4 and 5. He only sees these daughters about once a month and on holidays and gives them nothing in terms of financial support. With his second partner, he had 2 children, 2 boys. They're 12 and 13. He hasn't seen these boys in several years. He doesn't even know where they're living. But he is crazy about his young son, Julian. He describes his birth, coming out of the mother's womb, spinning like a bullet, as the most beautiful experience in his adult life. And he's also crazy about Deborah, his partner's other 2 children, who he loves taking to the park, to the Please Touch Museum, to Penn's Landing for outings. So David thinks he's a great dad. Yet he's left 4 children behind. This pattern of selective serial fathering puts kids on a father-go-round, and it puts men on a family go-round. But who's going to pay the college tuition when that child reaches age 18? So if you're depressed, I'm going to make you happy in the last 5 minutes. Instability and complexity are tractable. We can do something about this. And we can do what couples in these situations want to do. We can help them do more than what we want to do. A lot of times, left-leaning types, like most academics, at least most sociologists, right, will say, well, we shouldn't interfere in the family because people should do what they want. But people aren't doing what they want. When you ask young moms and young dads, what do you want your future to be? They say, I want to stay together and raise my child. In the Fragile Families and Child Well-Being Survey, 80% of unmarried parents, over 80%, claimed they were together with the other parent of that child. And most said there was a good or certain chance that they would marry that partner. These are their aspirations. We don't have to force those aspirations on anybody. I should also point out that usually when they say they don't want to get married, there's often a very good reason. So we should pay attention to that response as well. But even if not marriage, they want to stay together. They want to raise the child together. They recognize and believe that that's the best way to run a family, in part because the counterfactual is so complicated and so messy. So how are these things tractable? I'm just going to show a series of experiments. So this is sort of the gold standard in research that ought to give us some hope. The first is from the Minnesota Family Investment Program. This is a welfare to work experiment run in Minnesota in the years leading up to welfare reform and beyond, that gave members of the experimental group, in this case it was experimental counties. My home county, Todd County, was in this study. I can't remember if it was an experimental or a control. But everybody had to go to my hometown restaurant where they put cheese whiz on everything. And nothing is fresh, despite the fact there are farms everywhere. But in any case, MFIP gave 2-parent families a modest supplement to their wages. Nothing like the EITC gives. And saw a dramatic reduction in family instability in the form of divorce. Almost beyond belief. Now, if you look at the divorce records, you don't see this dramatic result. That's because poor people don't have the money to get divorced officially. But when you ask people what their marital status is, they'll tell you in the MFIP study that their relationship, that they're together. They're not broken up. So just a few $100s in a wage supplement for people who are working, right, playing by the rules as America has set them, where in order to be a citizen, you have to be a worker. That's amazing. You can't see this, so I shouldn't have put it up. But I'll tell you the punchline. This is a very unexpected result. You know, usually when we do educational interventions, we don't measure family outcomes. After seeing this chart, I began going around saying all policy is family policy, because this study shows that it is possible, right, along with MFIP, frankly, in Wisconsin's New Hope. It shows that you can get a lot of mileage in the family domain if you intervene in education. These are career academies. They're alternative high schools based around a theme, part of the small schools movement. Basically, kids get attention from adults. Things are a little bit more organized. Students have a bit more hope. Dick Murnane and Greg Duncan wrote an excellent sort of implementation description of what happens in these schools. But they're not rocket science, right? And they're implemented in some of the most challenging school districts of the nation. So these are not kids who, get the kinds of SATs that can get them into Washington and Lee. But we see a dramatic increase in the probability that a man, 8 years later, just by virtue of going to this high school, lives independently with his child and partner. Okay, I'm throwing this one in for fun. This is Perry Preschool. They didn't actually measure, unfortunately, family outcomes, although they could have. But look at the reductions in crime. This is a preschool program. A preschool program. And these are adult outcomes. This is from the Perry Preschool at 40 report. Amazing. Finally, we have the program that Ron and I have been observing for a decade or more, the Family Expectations Program in Oklahoma City. And there we have this is a direct intervention in the family. It teaches volunteers who are on Medicaid, and again, I emphasize the word volunteers, relationship skills, including those kinds of skills that reduce domestic violence. We see a 20% impact on the probability 3 years later, after the intervention, that a couple will be continuously living together. And no increase in domestic violence. Now, I teach the Poverty and Public Policy course at the Kennedy School. Some students say, well, your course, Dr. Edin, should really be called Nothing Works. Because, I give them I outline the problem, they show them this solution, and then we get to the impact evaluation, and there's a null result or a tiny result. 20%, ladies and gentlemen. So the evidence is coalescing around a hypothesis that I'd like you to entertain as we conclude, that perhaps, A, by doing better what we already are supposed to do, that is creating excellent educational environments for children. Excellent. The kind that every American child deserves. Have you ever been in a Camden middle school or high school? If we wouldn't send our kids there, we shouldn't be sending any children there. Right? We can make headway by doing better what we're already doing. Imagine if we had great schools and decent jobs. Right? And there's some evidence that in very high quality interventions, carefully constructed, we can actually also intervene directly, not by pushing marriage, but by teaching people the skills they need to get along and raise their kids productively together. And by the way, if you visit this program and you watch the dads, they love it. Trust me. Okay, so to conclude, I want you to come away with 3 things. And I have 1 minute left. I'm so proud of myself. First, social policy can work. Look at the EITC. It can change the way poor people feel about themselves. That's amazing, right? Second, got to pay attention to the dads. You really, really do. We can't keep thinking about the family as a mother and child. I teased A.G. Chowdhury, who works at ACF, after the meeting I was in, that what they should call the Administration for Children and Families, the Administration for Children and Mothers. Obviously, we need to expand our vision of the family. And I think third, and I'm hoping this will come up in the discussion, so this is more of a preview comment. If people are committed to the truth, irrespective of what side of the political aisle they're on, solutions can be found. My friend Ron Haskins is one of those people, and I hope I am one as well. So I look forward to Ron's remarks and a productive discussion. Thank you.